Hello dear Motorsport-Magazin friends and Formula One fans on qualifying day here in Austin. Max Verstappen only qualified P6 for the Grand Prix on Sunday. Who would have expected that? That was really the big sensation of the day. Many of you will say, but wait a minute, actually he would have been on pole. In his last attempt he set the fastest time by a few thousandths of a second, but that was then relatively quickly revoked. In the penultimate corner, he went too wide, a track limits violation, so the time didn't count. Track limits were once again a foregone conclusion. Even in free practice, there were 78 laps that would have been cancelled. Track limits are not being punished in practice, but they are recorded anyway. So it was to be expected that we would have this discussion again in qualifying. I don't want to go into the track limit discussion at this point. Anyway, that's how Max Verstappen lost pole position, but then only the second fastest attempt in Q3 counted. And that was just good enough for 6th position, and that says a lot about the balance of power here in general, how close the whole field is together, the top 9 within 4.5 tenths of a second. So that was so incredibly close, it was like the best DTM times, if you like. And it also says a lot that Max Verstappen and Red Bull really had to stretch themselves today. And that was already apparent in free practice when Dr. Helmut Marko warned to be careful. This is going to be a really close qualifying, he said. Then in Q1 and Q2, Max Verstappen didn't finish in first position. Yes, he used a bit fewer tires to save them for Q3, but so did a few other drivers. So you could already see that things weren't going so well, and that was actually very surprising because the RB19 is the all-rounder in the field. And if you have to be anything on this track at the Circuit of the Americas, it's actually an all-rounder. This track has everything: fast corners, slow corners, a long straight, and then you would actually have expected the RB19 to actually be quite superior here. Red Bull also assumed that they would be ahead, but the problem was that they approached the simulations a bit wrongly. They didn't expect the bumps to be so extreme. Bumps are always a big issue here in Austin. The track was washed out once, which caused a lot of subsidence, which is why all these bumps occur. Actually, a core renovation would have been necessary at some point, but that wasn't done. They kept repairing things a bit, repaving a few spots, but they didn't do the big general renovation, and that's why the track keeps sinking. The situation varies in different places because there are underpasses and so on, and there is also a certain infrastructure under the track, which is why more and more bumps are forming. Red Bull didn't expect that, so they came up with a somewhat incorrect setup in the simulator, and they have to make do with that setup for the rest of the weekend, because you know the game by now. After free practice, when you go into qualifying, there are already parc fermé regulations, which means you can't change anything on the setup. Still, it's not all that bad because it would have been pole position, even if you have to stretch a lot more, and we know that the RB19 only shows its true strength in the race. We can't say quite as much about the long runs. In this one session there were a few long runs, but the teams were also on different programs. Mercedes, for example, was much lighter than the competition, but what you have to say in any case, something like in Qatar must not be repeated from Red Bull's point of view. In Qatar there was the big tire issue, 3 mandatory pit stops. There are also many curbs here, very high speeds at which you drive on the curbs, and also for a relatively long time. But Pirelli says that's no problem, it's just not the Qatar speeds. It's not the time spent on the curbs as it was in Qatar, and the curbs are different. 25 millimeters instead of 50 millimeters, so there's no problem there. They're expecting a regular 2-stop race, medium, medium, hard, or hard, hard, medium, so that should suit Red Bull. High tire wear is common here, so we assume that Max Verstappen will still have a good chance in the race, but from 6th position he'll have to work his way up. But if that's possible anywhere, it's on this track, which is not only sensationally beautiful to drive, but also really good for racing. Now we've talked a lot about Max Verstappen, a lot about the 6th place driver, but we haven't even said who's on pole yet. Charles Leclerc actually made it, even if he didn't believe it for a while, because his race engineer told him that the track lap time had been deleted, and then added, yes, Max Verstappen's, and Charles Leclerc first thought that his own lap time had been deleted, and then he half freaked out on the radio and had a heart attack. Funny situation at that point, but Charles Leclerc was allowed to keep his lap time. Pole position for Ferrari. Probably not many people would have expected that. Of course, the race is another discipline, but even there they have been able to improve a bit lately. Charles Leclerc didn't really come back from the summer break that well. Carlos Sainz took a bit of the edge off him, but then there were updates to the Ferrari that eliminated the understeer a bit, and since then Charles Leclerc has been getting along a bit better. Today he converted that into this pole position, followed by Lando Norris by 130 thousandths. McLaren proved that they are now strong on all tracks, and some people see McLaren as the favorites for the race because they tend to have fewer problems with tire wear than Ferrari. But then there's Lewis Hamilton, the absolute specialist on the circuit of the Americas. If any track suits any driver particularly well, it's Lewis Hamilton here in Austin. 139 thousandths of a second off pole position, which meant he was only third. You can see how close it is, and there might even have been a bit more in it if he had been able to go one better in the last attempt. So pole position was definitely possible. Mercedes also brought a major update to the floor, the last big one of the season for Mercedes, and that paid off. It worked immediately, at least for him. Russell, on the other hand, had bigger problems already in FP1 or in the solitary practice. He then worked a bit on the setup of the car and still got to 5th position, but he was clearly trailing Lewis Hamilton. I think that's track-specific, simply the Hamilton thing here, which I've just mentioned, but that was the qualifying for the Grand Prix on Sunday. Tomorrow we have the sprint shootout and the sprint, so I'm curious to see what you think. Feel free to write in the comments how it will turn out, and then you can watch the video from today again after the sprint to be prepared for the race. But now we'll take a look at the Haas, because they've unpacked the B specification here. We already talked about it yesterday. A bit sobering when you look at the results. Kevin Magnussen 14th on the grid, Nico Hülkenberg only 16th, although both were still in the top 10 in free practice, and at one point it looked as if the B spec would be a real hit. Nico Hülkenberg set a really good time right away, but then, well, it didn't go so great anymore. His lap time was cancelled, but it didn't matter because it was already messed up after the first sector anyway. He was irritated, twice by Red Bull in turn 1 by Sergio Perez, who was not in his way, but as a result he lost the braking point a bit, then in the fast corner meandering by Max Verstappen, also not hindered, but he irritated him. Nico was really mad at the timing, really mad at himself. It didn't go so well in free practice because he had also underestimated the bumps a bit, then they changed the setup a bit and he was much better in qualifying, but for the reasons mentioned it wasn't better for him after all. That's why he's sad and angry, but you can also see that the update actually works quite well right away, even on a single lap, which wasn't really the goal, because they even feared that it could go a bit backwards. At least in the short term, the big hope is then the race trim, that it should be better there, and they are quite satisfied with the setup, so they left qualifying with one eye laughing and one eye crying. Haas B-Spec update. Already at the beginning of the season, they brought a new pit gantry. You've probably heard a lot about it. But the full details you can read in our current print edition. The team has only 3 seats at the pit wall, but one of them was reserved for your Motorsport-Magazin. We were allowed to take a seat, talk to team manager Peter Kroller, and he explained to us how this mini pit gantry works exactly, why you actually do not need more, and why next year there will be 1 additional seat. Link to the print edition is in the description. Then we have to talk about Aston Martin at the end of this video. They also have a lot of new parts here, but both drivers dropped out in Q1. Fernando Alonso only in 17th position on the grid, Lance Stroll in 19th. You could say Fernando Alonso is now showing solidarity with his teammate, but that was anything but voluntary. Already in the first free practice session there were problems at the front left, the brakes overheated on both cars, and something even caught fire on Lance Stroll's car, which is why he was only able to complete 5 laps, which is of course anything but optimal preparation for qualifying. Fernando Alonso also suffered from this problem and had to spend more time in the pits. Afterwards he was able to go out on the track again, but he didn't find the right setup either, especially with the updates, which you have to understand first and adjust the car accordingly. It didn't work out that way, and he was also a bit unlucky because there was a big traffic jam at the end of Q1 in the pit lane. So most of the drivers, or many drivers at the back, had to drive the outlap really fast in order to get across the line at all in time. Fernando Alonso had to drive the outlap too fast and his tires overheated at the end of the 3rd sector, so he didn't get the best out of it, only 17th on the grid for him. It's set not only for an exciting Grand Prix on Sunday, but also for the sprint. We're looking forward to it. We're really excited to see whether it's just going to be a repeat, whether Red Bull can strike back, whether Max Verstappen stays within the track limits. This time it wasn't much, but it was enough, and then hopefully we won't be talking about track limits tomorrow, but about a really exciting sprint. I'm also excited about the tire choice again. That's going to be a really good affair.